Raise your horns high and let your spirit flow. It's the classic metal wrap-up show. Feel the rush, let the loudness grow. It's the classic metal wrap-up show.
So I was just mentioning that Joel, about a year ago, my wife was doing some painting, and she was.
I didn't do it.
No, you didn't do it. The wind did it, but I asked her to come down from the ladder. Being the nice guy thing to do. I'll go up there. I'll finish painting the side of the barn. She hops down, forgot the hammer on the top step, and I look up only to see this hammer coming down, and I just cringed and looked downward, and it smacked me right in the noodle. And so it was a concussion.
Yeah, it's a good thing you didn't look up, man.
And that's when I for some reason, I think Joel, we were like exchanging texts or something. And you're like, you need to get that checked out because that isn't good news. And I'm like, okay, I'm hearing it from Joel, my wife. I'm like, that's a second opinion. I think I'm gonna go. A dude said to go get my head checked, so I'm gonna go get it checked, and I did. And thankfully, I had an indentation in my head for like 6 months, dude. It was awful.
Yeah. By the way, this is Coconut, man. She likes to get in on all my fucking podcasts. She's
right on.
She's like a tech whiz. Yeah, she knows how to answer my phone. She slides the button across and she locks me on my computer. But every time I do a podcast, she needs
attention.
She's got to make a furry belly entrance, man.
Right.
But,
nice. So you caught on to something there, Joel. You're like, hey, we got ZZ Top in the house. So we'll go around the room here.
I hope you didn't get offended by that.
No.
Evil Andrew, right? Or Evil and Andrew.
Evil and Andrew.
Or is Andrew evil? I know Ruben's got some dark secrets, but
not very not terrible.
So how are you guys all connected?
We're all connected because we love rock and roll music, believe it or not. So there you go. So in the process of getting together on Sundays, we chat about music. We were just chatting about M3, David Lee Roth, some Sammy Hagar, some Wolfgang Van Halen. So it was like Van Halen-esque type discussion.
Conversation.
So now we got you, which, I tried to get you on around Easter, and I think you were busy, obviously, holiday. So we pulled you in today, and we wanted to chat about a couple of things, amongst other things that you may have a few minutes to fill us in on. But I tried to turn these guys on to Cats and Boots because, again, that's how I first got introduced to you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. That was about the Cats and Boots was the vehicle that made my splash for me. I did a bunch of stuff before that too. I was actually on Atlantic Records. So I mean, music kind of became a default for me. I grew up in Cleveland during the 60s and 70s. And so, man, I don't know if you guys really understand like what Cleveland was about. Not many really people do. Everybody went Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. Why? But if you grew up here, it was kind of like Cleveland for rock and roll was like the equivalent of a teenage soldier going to Vietnam. It was like, wow, and we had so many concerts here that they just couldn't fit them all. They used to have these things where the Cleveland Browns stadium was loaded, every weekend in the summer, it was packed, 100,000 people. And, they had these things, they just started calling them World Series of Rock because you had like Peter Frampton, Bob, Seger, Ted Nugent, all these giant bands, AC/DC, and Pink Floyd, and, the Rolling Stones played with Kansas and Peter Tosh. And then they introduced Prince and everybody whipped bottles at him because it was like, skinny little black guy in women's underwear, the Rolling Stones crowd in that, in 100-degree temperature. But man, we saw it all. Cleveland was it was music, and then on the dark side, there was a lot of drugs and violence. And to be honest, I grew up kind of a latchkey kid. I was an accident. So it was like the parents worked, the sisters were older hippies, and I got dragged around. They dragged me to concerts, and I said, all I smelled was, I was only this tall, so I couldn't see above anybody's belt loops, so everything was like concerts to me as a kid were like, I smelled sweaty ass crack and weed,
There you go.
Peace, love, and sweaty ass
Right.
crack. So that was the 60s for me. But growing up, it's a good thing that I really got pulled into music because my parents weren't rich. I wasn't going to college, and majority of my friends were either, heading 6 feet under or going to prison. Because we were a bunch of little criminals. But that, it started that way. But during that period of time, I was always just in bands. Ever since I was like in junior high school, we had bands. We played in the garage, and I remember breaking out of the garage and having a cover band to play parties was like a huge accomplishment. So I kind of, learned at a young age what it meant to really work hard and bust out, and it was competitive, I mean, I don't know if you guys are from the Northeast, but, there's no warm, fuzzy kindness on the streets here. If you suck, you're going to find out real quick you suck. And I found out real quick that as a guitar player, I suck. So if I wanted to stay a member of the band, I better learn how to sing. And so I did, but I so you kind of evolved, through as a kid, you evolve. I started jamming in my guitar in the basement and wiring shit up that should have burned my mom and dad's house down. But the we eventually evolved into playing, school dances and keg parties and made it up to the bar scene. I remember I got recruited by these older guys, they actually had hair in their chest, and on their face. They were older dudes, but I was too young to get into any of these biker bars. And the Hells Angels really had a grip over this part of Cleveland. In fact, my oldest cousin was one of the founders of Chapter 9 Hells Angels in Cleveland. And I don't know if you ever saw, Kill the Irishman, the Danny Green story.
Right.
He was part of that whole crew, and so I grew up, with my cousins, and they were serious Hells Angels, and a lot of them were ex-Vietnam vets. And so it was not common, it was not uncommon, for them to say, hey, I want my little cousin's band to play. But, a lot of these little nightclubs, they used to sneak me in through the back door in the alley, the stage door, okay, it's time to go on. They'd sneak me in through the alley. I'd get up on stage and then I'd have to sneak back out the alley and go party in the parking lot. And so that's how I got my start in music. But those guys that I eventually honed a band with, phenomenal musicians, like really gifted. So, you kind of like gravitate, and clump together, like oil on water. And eventually you come up with, I was in a band, we called ourselves Rage. And we did a battle of the bands at Chanel High School, where Joe Walsh and Rush used to play the same gymnasium. Rush would come over from Toronto right over the lake, jam at our high school. And Joe Walsh grew up here. And so they had this little battle of the bands. And I'll never forget, I knew that we were good at that battle of the bands. And I actually have a recording that I might digitize and give you guys as a cover band. And so there were these young kids, and their mom and dad bought them these guitars, and they had these little amps and a little drum set and this and that. And, they were playing stuff like Smoke on the Water. And we had our road crew wheel in, a 15, 20-foot stack of PA speakers. And, we had our wall of amps and stuff like that. And we opened up with Rush, YYZ, and ripped into Blue Oyster Cult and Ozzy. And we sounded, if I played you the tape, we sounded like, I'm not going to go as far as to say, but no, I mean, you listen to this, this could have been those guys. Like one of the songs we played was The Real Me by The Who. And, you listen to Grizz, my bass player, who I still jam with, and you can't tell him from Entwistle, and we were high school kids. And so long story short, I split, left Cleveland, and went to LA, and then eventually those guys followed me, and we all bunkered down in a little, one bedroom studio flat in the 666 police beat of Hollywood, off Coanga and Franklin. And that's within a couple of months. We just started passing out our cassette tapes, and within a couple of months we were getting calls from Dweezil Zappa and the guys in Rat and Motley, and they were all calling, just saying, you guys are fucking phenomenal, this and that. And then we were just a bunch of partying maniacs like everyone else. And I'll never forget, we had those little answering machines. This was before cell phones.
Yeah.
But we had this little answering machine in our apartment, right? And with the cassette tape, people would call on it. Yeah. And this one time we came back from the Rainbow, and we pushed play, and it's, hey guys, this is Gene Simmons of Kiss. He goes, I got a hold of your tape and I want to produce you. Call me back. Everybody's like, ah! And by the end of the night, we realized that, somebody spilled beer all over the answering machines. It's Gene's fucking number. And but for a while, we got a hold of him, and he had us courted by Casablanca Records, and then Ahmet Erdogan and Doug Morris from Atlantic Records. They signed us. Kenny Austin, he got a hold of our music and just said, we want you on Atlantic. But problem was back in the day, and that was my high school band from Cleveland. And so then, back in the day, there was just so much cocaine around. I mean, there was more cocaine than food or water in Hollywood. And Kenny Austin's office was one of those places where you walked in and had to have your ski goggles on. And, but so that, the cocaine, that whole scene was never really conducive to success for anybody. It was, the 80s, even though it was a fun decade of decadence, which, by the way, I sang on that record with Motley. That's in the background.
Okay.
But little unknown Joel trivia.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, it was at the peak of Hollywood's, most toxic, I think, phase. And I have a lot of respect for musicians who, really weathered that and went on to stay professional without skipping a beat. Guys like Rudy Sarzo, and, I mean, there's so many guys that, well, there's two types of guys. There's guys that survived it, like Stephen Pearcy. My God, he's one of my best friends, in music, but he's a miracle. He's literally is a miracle, man. He doesn't really talk about his personal life much, but his story turned out like a fairy tale, as opposed to a lot of guys, like Robin Crosby, for instance. I mean, there was a lot of guys that took a nosedive, and I think the 80s could have been so much better. But it became so competitive. It was kind of sad, because growing up in the 60s, I was inspired, and going to concerts in the 70s, I was really inspired by the masters of music, guys who crafted their music. I mean, it's just, and a lot of those guys became my friends, like the band Yes, and Zeppelin and Floyd and everything. You look at it from the Beatles up. I mean, that whole era from the 60s up into the 70s, and especially the 70s, everybody learned to not only master their craft, but mastered song crafting and innovating their sound. I mean, you had Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page and David Gilmour, and, bands like Jethro Tull, and just on and on and on. And, and Humble Pie. And these are all my early influences, So coming out of that and going into Hollywood in the 80s was kind of, bittersweet in the moment, if you can, because you looked around, and I was like really disappointed, in a way, whereas like most of my friends that I met were great musicians, like I immediately became friends with all the guys in Dio's band, and Ronnie, and Ozzy's band, and Rat, and Motley Crue, and great, Jack Russell from Great White was one of my very close buddies. Jack's voice was like a violin, and
Mm.
two of the most inspirational comrades, were Steven Tyler and Jack Russell. And when we were together, like Steven was always like, it would be like, you're like, hey man, what's going on? Great. Okay. Warm-ups, like right away. And he would always be like, don't even get out of bed and start talking without a warm-up. Steven is a serious vocal scientist. And Jack Russell's the same way. Jack and I, when we got together, there were three topics. Um, there was shark fishing, there were women, and the voice, and probably in that opposite order. But we spent a lot of good time out on his fishing boat, trying to hunt down the great whites.
Yeah.
Never, sometimes just got too polluted to ever get the boat out of the harbor. I actually have a lot of video that we shot on his boat, and his widow Heather she's gonna let me put it out and edit it. Jack wanted me to do it when he was alive, but yeah, I was a little, I wouldn't say I was disappointed, maybe a little bit dismayed. But I felt myself getting pulled into that. I was friends with Poison before they got their deal. Their Kathy Page was working with Rod Smallwood, who managed Iron Maiden. And Rod just was like, he couldn't stand Poison. And when Poison came out with their Billboard, everybody thought it was a joke, like these guys, they're not, it's like the New York Dolls might be cool. And it's cool when Mick Jagger wears makeup, but what the fuck is this? And everybody thought it was a joke. But Kathy Page, she was tremendous. She worked with Rod, and she said, I believe in these guys. I can get them a deal on Capitol. And he said, go for it. Go for it. And she did, and the rest is history. But I was being friends with bands like that. Most of the guys that I was involved with at the time, they were already successful. So there was like, I never really felt that competitive nature. I felt like what do I got to do to be an equal with these guys? And that was kind of my goal. And it was a great place to be. But then it just seemed like after Poison got their deal, it was like, then the hair metal was actually a joke. I mean, we created that as a joke, hair metal. It was like, because these guys literally cared more about their hair and the spandex and, than they did about crafting their music. So for me, it was either that whole phony facade of just wanting to be a pretty rocker, and learning three chords and, whatever, chicks and drugs, or leave the country with a Japanese guy that, that plugs a classic Les Paul directly into a Marshall stack with no pedals and just cranks it to 11 and says, let's go to Japan and, eat lots of sushi and sake and, have a bunch of slanted pink tacos and just, rock on. And I was just like, it was a no-brainer for me.
Right.
But with Mary Hoax, the whole drug thing kind of saturated. So it was either the phony thing, and or the dark side, the drugs. And once again, it was kind of like, well, I know how to handle this because I grew up in Cleveland, and I escaped from Cleveland, so I can escape from this. And going to Japan was kind of cool because there were no drugs. Well, at least not on the first tour. I mean, but the Yakuza was our, they picked up success real quick. Yeah, all of our best friends were assassins, with tattoos. And then Mr. Udo grabbed us, and then we had a #1 record, and it was like, okay, shit, we only did this to have fun. Now what do we do? I'm stuck. No, because I never really imagined myself in that kind of music. Jam was doing like this poppy Memphis type stuff, and I was just like, yeah, no, I'm really, well, if it's gonna get us laid and make us money in Japan, let's do it. But it didn't, for me, it didn't transpire to the States. And so the first record, it was cool, and I understood that the Japanese audiences had like a certain rhythm. they went to a different beat. They were a lot younger, and sociopolitically, they were more like, it was more innocent and underground. It was like kind of like when the British invasion broke, in America. There was a lot of what they called panic, and we generated a lot of panic, So we shut down parts of Tokyo when we played, and our record was moving like 50,000 units a month through a magazine ad. And, so I really literally knew nothing about the business, and I got thrust into it so fast that it's probably like the main contributing factor that how I got ripped off to millions by greedy fucking managers and, just crazy shit. Heavy Bones was the worst. I mean, we fired our manager for Cats and Boots because he was, I found out when Motley Crue asked us to open for him on the girls tour, and then we didn't have any tour support. I'm like, where is it? And we find out, the guy's got, he was exploiting our money, and mistresses, and then he used our tour support money to produce not was it Steelheart, I think, you guy with the really super high voice, but he used money to get that band, recorded and everything, and the timing hit for our record to break, and Motley was going to break us. We had no tour support, so we got a big argument. He's like, "Oh no, the label wants you to make a second album," and I said, "How?" And the label said, "No, we're sorry, you lost your A&R guy, but you can go ahead and work that record because we think there's like a half dozen, charting singles on that record. We think it's a big record, But we fired our manager because we found out that he was, fucking with us. But then when I went to Heavy Bones, it got even uglier. Dave Kaplan, he stole all my publishing that I had coming to me from Cats and Boots I just found out about it. He made a deal with Coca-Cola and Warner Brothers for the Olympic thing because our song went on a shrink wrapped in every six-pack of Coca-Cola, for the Olympics. And so it was supposed to be a new artist promotion. And every six-pack that got sold during the 91 Olympics had a cassette tape, Warner Brothers New Music. Well, he made a backhanded deal for 10 cents a copy, and they sold over 93 million copies. And so, there's millions. So, if there's any advice I can give to anybody out there, it's, get an education on money before you get into the business. Things are different now, though.
Yeah.
I hope I answered your question.
No, that's a pretty good synopsis of the history through the Heavy Bones. I don't know. I think Evil might have some questions about Heavy Bones because we turned him on to Heavy Bone, not Heavy Bones, Cats and Boots. I think you were familiar with Heavy Bones.
And I'd heard the band name Cats and Boots, but I'd never had the chance back in those days because I was just a 13-year-old, 14-year-old kid to actually get the cassette. Because in those days, a cassette was $10, and you were like, I got to know I want this cassette if I'm going to spend this money on this thing, So you see all these bands in the magazines, and you see all these names, and you're like, well, which one do I get? Who's got what? So I know I read about Cats and Boots, but my question was, how did you link with Takashi, the guitar player? Where did you meet him?
Well, that kind of goes back to the timing when my guitarist Denny. I mean, he's always been kind of a tortured artist, but I think he was like an alcoholic at 16. I told you when I came from Cleveland, there was a lot of, but yeah, he got on heroin, and it wasn't pretty. And I wasn't gonna go down that road. I mean, I had learned at a young age, I had a friend of mine overdose in my arms at a well, not in my arms. I mean, I've seen heroin knock off friends of mine firsthand. When you get the touch of a cold hand. When you're trying to get your friend up, like, hey, you think he's just drunk and then he's dead. So I wasn't going to play with that. And I wasn't going to play around with that. So I left the band, and as you can imagine, it took a lot for me to leave because these were like my childhood buddies,
Yeah.
And those are the best bands, guys that grew up together. I mean, look at Aerosmith and the Beatles and Stones and all, I mean, bands that, and so And I was smart enough to know that. But I was also friends with the Zappa. I was very close to the Zappa family. So Dweezil was a very good friend of mine, and Frank, as much as people wouldn't think so, Frank just never did drugs. Never. I mean, I can't really say I wasn't with him his whole career, but he wasn't. He was against drugs. He was a genius, and the kids, it was a clean household. In fact, Frank died of colon cancer. He just wasn't willing to accept any kind of therapies or medicinal or whatever you want to call it. Just refused to be drug induced. But by the way, Frank gave Cats and Boots our first deal on EMI.
Oh, okay. There you go.
And my lawyer, my attorney, Peter Lopez, greatest music attorney in history. And sadly, he's not with us, or Frank. But I remember calling Frank from Tokyo, and I'm like, "What do we do? Like, we've got so much money, and the record companies are like, they're." It's like guerrilla warfare, man. They're coming out of the bushes throwing money at us and girls. And what do we do? And I was like on the 77th floor of the Warner Pioneer Towers in Roppongi. And he goes, Joel, he goes, we should. I remember it was like 1 a.m. in Tokyo, and it was middle of the afternoon in LA. And Dweezil answers. I go, man, we got a problem, man. Our record's huge, and all these record companies, I don't know anything about the business. And I learned from Atlantic Records, that you can get screwed real easy. But then he says, hold on, let me get Frank. And Frank gets on the phone. He goes, Joe, I told him, he says, Joe, we should all have such problems. He goes, take everything they've got to give you. Don't sign anything, and I'll have you a deal before you hit American soil. And that's the way it panned out. And so Frank called and got us a deal through Ira Herzog, who handled his estate and the Jacksons and the Madonna and Frank. And so Ira Herzog, just a powerful, humble little Jewish guy in New York, man. And he rang a bell. They kicked open the door at EMI, and then we got the deal. Peter Lopez crafted it. I mean, that's twice. I had a ticket to ride, man.
Yeah.
And Cats and Boots was given the largest record deal EMI ever gave in the history of the label to a new artist, because we hadn't even gotten to the States yet, and we had a #1 album. We were moving 50,000 units a month. And then with Warner Brothers, when Cats and Boots dissolved, Michael Austin, who was president of Warner Music, he called Peter and he said, tell Joel just to come over to Warner Brothers. I've got a contract, and a beautiful contract, and a blank check waiting for him. Just tell him to come over. And I made the stupidest career deviating mistake ever. And I said, no, I want to do the band thing, the brotherhood, that I left behind with the Hoax, like Aerosmith, this, I'm going to do a band, but times had changed, man. And people were all out for themselves, and it was kind of sad, so, but I, all those guys onto my record label, I love Frankie. I'd been friends with him for a long time, but I don't know. I think he had, some psychological scars from Quiet Riot and things like that. Cause there was, I don't even want to get into that mess, but maybe you can ask Carlos or Rudy one day.
Right.
But yeah, those guys they were seduced by the money, and I kept telling them, and I brought in Gary Hoey, the guitarist. He was a teacher at GIT, and I brought him in because, I came off the streets of Cleveland from garage and party bands to LA to the major labels. And here I was, I was all over MTV, and I was, justifiably a star, right? And successful major label artist. But, I wanted to, with this opportunity, I wanted to, the answer to your question is that then he got on heroin. Kenny Austin got shit canned from Atlantic, although his father, Mo Austin, was the president of WEA, Warner Electra Asylum. And so Kenny never really got fired. He just got pulled out of there, stuck in rehab, and then they gave him a really high-ranking A&R position at Electra. And I was still a little bitter, and I really didn't understand, what it would have meant for us. There's twice I turned my back on a great opportunity with a different label, and one of them was with Kenny. I was living up in Beverly Hills and Truesdale Estates, and he pulled up in my driveway in a Corniche with a briefcase just packed with cash. I think he had $20,000 in it. And I wouldn't open my door for him. He goes, just look under the door. And I looked under, it was like, and I looked and he had it open. It was just packed with cash. He goes, there's 20 grand cash. Just take it. And no one will know you have it. Just come with me to Electra. And I was just like, Benny's on heroin. I'm doing this. I had just joined Rough Cut because Paul Shortino left. And so, there's a lot of things. And I just said, no, man, I'm not going down that road. I was shell shocked from the whole drug scene in Cleveland, and that, then Hollywood and everything else. And, so I left. I left Mary Hoax, and I told those guys, I just can't do this. I want success. And I was very serious and driven, very, very focused, very driven. And I had a lot of people around me. I mean, Billy Sheehan and I were just talking about it. I was with him in Nashville. We played, Billy and I just played together. We did a Humble Pie tune at a jam. And, there's just mutterings about maybe possibly putting a Talus thing together and, touring together. But I can't speak for Billy. I don't know what he's going to do, but it would be really cool for me because I've always been a Talus fan. But the thing of it is that back in those days, I had so many people around me like Billy or Rudy or, Robert Sarza or Jack, and, all these people that were so serious about their craft and their art. And that's what I grew up with, So, I wanted to follow that way. I just felt like going backwards into Electra, but I know that Kenny had to prove himself. So if we had gone over to Electra, they would have spared no expense to freaking pump high octane into our futures. And, but that's when I met Tekashi. So when Mary Hoax was jamming around at the country club or at the Weston's Country Club or at the FM station or at Kazari's or, the Whiskey, the Roxy, we were playing all over the place. And this Japanese guy who was really sick of the kabuki makeup shredder scene, just as much as I was sick of the whole Randy Rhoads wannabe shredders. Everybody either wanted to be Eddie Van Halen or Randy Rhoads. And it was just like, they all had Charvels. I'm like, what the fuck happened to P90s and humbuckers?
Yeah.
What happened to that? Where'd it go? Because that's rock and roll for me. You never saw Jimmy Page playing a Charvel. And playing 9,000 notes a minute. I could admire that, but you got to wonder if 10-year-old kids can do it. It's one thing for the innovators who did that. Randy Rhoads was brilliant genius, right? Mm-hmm. But then you got, it's like a trail of ants following these guys, and it just gets more washed out the longer, and it just after a while, to me in my head, it was just like, but then you listen to guys who can play like that. I used to go and sit and listen to Frank Zappa. I remember Dweezil and I being down in the basement, and he had his synclaviers with the screens flashing, memory overload, and he was in there doing G-string tornado, and it made sense, all that shredding. And then you go back and listen to Apostrophe and records like that, Peaches on Regalia or whatever it else is. And it makes sense. Okay. But what was happening with these bands in LA, it wasn't making sense, because a guitar solo, it should sing, it should be lyrical, it should be melodic, it should be a second set of lyrics, So I was with Rough Cut, and he was following me around with the tape recorder, and he was looking for a specific kind of singer to go back to Japan with, and he knew that, if he had the right guy, that, that he would turn the music world, up on its head, he'd make their head spin if he went back and did this. And what was kind of cool is back then, tattoos were strictly forbidden unless you were in the Yakuza. And he had tattoos over. He didn't give a fuck. He looked like Sid Vicious. He plugged into a Marshall. He cranked up his Les Paul. And it was just like, my prayers are answered. But at the time I had just joined Rough Cut, and we were opening for Ronnie James Dio at Pacific Amphitheater, and it was kind of cool because it was like my christening, official christening. I was friends with all these guys, but now I was at their level. I mean, Jack Russell and I are backstage, doing vocal warm-ups. We're getting ready to open for Ronnie James Dio. Quiet Riot was playing. I think Rat and Dokken, Michael Schenker. I mean, just the list went on. It was Children of the Night, sponsored KNAC and everything. And that's where I got my stage name, because we used to rehearse in a little building right in between the Roxy and the Whiskey. There was a little rehearsal place at Rough Cut we used to do. And I was with David Alford from Shreveport, Louisiana on drums, and Matt Thorne bass and Amir Durak on guitar. And what a fucking great band we were, I mean, those guys, phenomenal. And we could have really, put Rough Cut on the map, with my vocals and stuff. And I was ready to make my break. But Frankie Benelli, as I'm going on stage, as I'm doing my vocal warm-ups, I'm working with Jack, and it was actually the first time, Jack and I had said hi to each other. We never really became friends. I never forget, it was August 1st, 1987. And so we were hanging out, and we immediately became buddies. And I said, man, I listened to your records to warm up. I didn't mean it in a bad way. And he's like, oh, great, thanks. But so we immediately became friends, but I told him, I said, I'm nervous as fuck. I've never sang in front of like 30,000 people, and these were hungry LA rock fans waiting for Dio to hit the stage.
Dio, yeah.
And so Ronnie was the only one that had a private room back there, but all of a sudden I feel a tap, and it's Ronnie, and he goes, did I hear you say that you're nervous and it's the first time? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, I don't want you to worry. He said, I'm going to call the soundboard. He says, and I'm going to tell my sound man to give you the full Ronnie. And it's full Ronnie. He goes, I'm going to have him give you the full Ronnie, the same mix that I sing through. It's like, holy shit. And Jack looked at me. He goes, you fucker. He goes, you warming up to your records. And then he comes back and he says, in fact, and he pulls a gold microphone out of a bag, and he goes, I want you to use my microphone. And
wow.
Yeah, true story, man. And so I went out there with Rough Cut, and I just couldn't believe it, man. You got to figure everything that I've done up until now has been like, the street club scene, studios, recordings, clubs on Sunset. But I opened my mouth through that PA system that was fucking, blowing the hair back on 30,000 fans. And I opened my mouth singing through Ronnie's mic, through his mix. And I literally, I don't even know what the word is to describe it. It wasn't like blown away, shocked, whatever you want to call it. It's indescribable. When I opened my mouth, what came out was like rocket engines out of the PA system. And it just startled me so much. I was like, what? Man, I was like, what? Like, I for a minute, I didn't realize, is this me or is it not me?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it startled me so much. I wasn't really looking where I was going. And there were all these 440 cable harnesses on the stage. There was so much gear. And I spun around as fast as I could. I was going to do this spin, and just fucking out of excitement, I just, and my foot got caught. So my foot stopped and my body kept spinning. And it just rang my leg like a rag. I felt everything go. My kneecap was down here. My legs, my bones were like that. My ACL was in a ball around my ankle. But the only thing that saved my leg was I was wearing a real tight pair of Jordache jeans. So it
held it together.
leg. So I tried to say it, and it's funny because the song that it happened on, we were playing Nobody's Fault, the Aerosmith song, off my favorite Aerosmith record, Rocks. And, the very first line that he sings is, after I rip my leg in half, I go, what else could this be? And it was like so fitting, right? And but yeah, so for me, so explanation here. So David Alford didn't understand that I had ripped my leg in half. And he thought that, and he didn't understand, why are you sitting down on the drum risers? And I guess the pain got so much and the adrenaline that I started getting so dizzy and I was about to pass out. So I signaled the guys over there to come help me out because everybody's like, what's going on, And so I was on the drum riser. All of a sudden, Frankie Benelli and Jack and Don Dokken and George Lynch and all these cats come over and they help me off the stage. And the paramedics are there, and then they put me on a stretcher, and Frankie tells the paramedics, get back, we got this. And they picked me up like an honorary, general on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And he put me in the ambulance, and they were like, you rock, But David Alford didn't understand that, and so he was like, get your fucking ass out of the hospital. We gotta go with you. Blah blah blah. You'll never work in this town again. And I'm just like, the fuck is that about, man? And then I ran into Takashi. And Takashi, rewind back to that experience. And then I said, yeah, man, I heard him plug in and we got in rehearsals and it just felt good, man. It just felt good. No more Charvels, no more rat distortion pedals, no more, solid state amps. It was just cranked tubes and humbucker. Yeah. And then I brought over Randy Mears. He was the second drummer for Black Oak, Arkansas, and he came from Houston. He just oozed character and fucking hardest hitting, and he had just we're still friends to this day, but just the wildest personality. But his crazy, wild ass Texas hillbilly personality was in every one of his roles and drums. He's really unique. If you go back and listen to the Mary Hoax and the Cats and Boots, he's unsung in a big way. And so Randy and I were the two Americans in the band, and then there was Takashi and Yasuhiro, who we just called Butch and Jam. And so
it's easier.
Yeah, but yeah, and there's a really cool segment by Downtown Julie Brown that she talks about us, and I think it pretty much sums us up really well. I have it. I actually digitized it. I've got like hundreds of hours of VHS tape that I'm digitizing. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but if there's anybody out there listening that wants to be an executive producer, I've got a shit fucking ton of behind the scenes and way behind the scenes footage. That camera was always rolling.
Raise your horns high.